Hi guys, I spoke to Johnbosco, a representative of the organisation We Own It, which is campaigning to protect public services like water and the NHS from privatisation, and where they are already in private hands to seek to bring them back under public ownership. Johnbosco spoke about the problems of privatisation beyond just the economics and what he hopes from a future Labour government. I hope you enjoyed this interview as it was a pleasure to speak with him. Wonderful thing. So I'm here with Johnbosco from We Own It. Johnbosco, can you tell us a bit about yourself and the organization?
Thank you so much, Mark, for having us. So I'm Johnbosco Nwogbo. I'm lead campaigner at We Own It. I'm originally Nigerian, but moved to the UK to study, and obviously caught the politics bug and got involved in campaigning against privatization of public ownership of public services. Yes, and have worked at We Own It for 3.5 years now. And as we head toward the general election, of course, with so much of our public services crumbling after decades of privatization. This is an incredible opportunity for us to put pressure on politicians and the government to demand that they reverse this damaging ideology. We Own It campaigns against privatization and for public ownership. We campaign on water, energy, public transportation, so rail and buses. We campaign on the NHS. We campaign on other things that we don't campaign too much on, but we can talk about as well, such as education. Yes, so we recently managed to, as part of a coalition, of course, get the government to reverse plans to close 1,000 ticket offices in England. People may be aware of that. Before that, we were able to force the government to scrap their plans to sell off Channel 4. And our modus operandi is to find opportunities where we think there is a clear path to a victory, to get a win and reverse privatization, to fight for it and to win. And we have a
Perfect.
really good track record of winning them.
Can you tell us about some of the, because maybe the general public over the last number of decades have been told about how privatization reduces cost for consumers, for example, when it's rail, or improves the service when it comes to the NHS. In what way is privatization a problem for public services and for the end user and the public?
Um, Obviously, the kind of on its face, it's almost seems as though you don't need to make the argument for why privatization is bad, right? If you have £2 to spend on something and somebody has to take away 50 pence out of that £2 in the form of profits, that means you now have just £1.5 to spend on that public service. And as a result, that's going to suffer. So on its face, it just does not work. But in reality, and I could kind of cite examples in terms of water and in energy and in rail, and of course we could come to the fact that Labour has announced recently that they're going to be taking rail into public ownership over the period of their first term. But I would like to spend a bit of time highlighting privatization in the NHS and the negative impact that it has. And perhaps a good way to kind of approach it is to tell it in the form of a story. In 2013, 2012, 2013, Commonwealth Fund, an American think tank, it's a free market think tank, but they ranked the NHS as the #1 health service in the developed world in terms of accessibility, in terms of costs, and in terms of a bunch of other criteria. Um, Fast forward 14 years after this conservative government took charge, privatization has increased in the NHS significantly, depending on who you ask. It's gone from around 1 or 2% to about 7% or about 20%, depending on how you calculate it. And the effect of that is kind of numerous. There is an Oxford University analysis from June of 2020 or 2022, sorry, that linked the deaths of 557 people directly to NHS outsourcing. And sometimes this is in the form of people getting sub-quality care in the private sector who are being paid for by the NHS. Other times it's when because obviously the private companies tend to prefer to provide the simpler services. Because we've outsourced those simpler services, the NHS itself having to deal with the most difficult cases and with not much budget left after outsourcing, people die within the NHS as a result of that, right? So that's one effect that it's having on our NHS. The second, of course, is a general effect that I highlighted earlier on. A much more recent Oxford University analysis from last month showed that when you outsource health services, they looked at outsourcing across Europe. And when you outsource health service, any health service, what follows is a reduction in the quality of the care that people get. And the two reasons that they identified for that was that number one is that the ratio of patients to medical professionals reduces drastically because private companies, because they want to make profit, they tend to hire fewer staff. And secondly, they tend to prefer to treat the most healthy patients. They don't want to treat the difficult, to any patient that has any complications. And I think that kind of brings us to that issue, the issue of privatization in the NHS, often presented to us as though it is a genuine solution to the crisis that the NHS is having. Whereas we know that number one is that private hospitals in the UK don't have A&Es. So if you're in a private hospital and a microwave falls on your head while you're in there, they will literally take you and put you in an ambulance and take you to an NHS hospital because they cannot deal with emergencies. That's number one. Number two is that they don't train doctors, right? About 17,500 doctors work in private hospitals in the UK. All 17 and a half of them were trained in the NHS at huge cost, about 8 billion or so to the public purse. So they don't train doctors. The crisis that we're facing in the NHS at the moment with our huge waiting lists is by and large a crisis of NHS staff. We don't have enough of them. There is about 150,000 staff vacancies in the NHS. If we don't invest in the NHS and divert money to the private sector, we're not going to train the staff who are going to fill those positions because the private companies don't treat them, don't train them.
Because some of the politicians have been saying that, well, to bring down the backlog, you can rely on the private sector. Is that true, or is there spare capacity in the private sector?
I mean, it's quite an interesting point to make, right? Because there is an atom of truth to it, but it hides something much more important, right? NHS doctors are having to take second and third jobs in the private sector because they're not being paid competitively with their colleagues across the world. Thousands of them have already left to countries like Canada, New Zealand, Australia as a result of this. So what they're essentially saying is those same NHS doctors who work in the NHS and have to do second and third jobs, we are going to pass on some of the surgeries that we can't do in the NHS to those same doctors, but they'll be working for Spire Health or Circle Health or some other private hospital, right? It's a very topsy-turvy analysis, but also it's quite incredible what this does to the NHS, besides the fact that it drains doctors out of the NHS. Private hospitals don't have their own doctors. They take NHS doctors. But something else it does is it actually puts more burden on the NHS. 550 people who are treated, who get surgeries in private hospitals every single month are then transferred to the NHS because they had an emergency while they were getting a surgery in the private hospitals. Every single month, 550 people. And that heaps a burden on the NHS as a result of that. Private hospitals just do the surgery. The NHS does every step of the surgery, both before the actual cutting and what happens after the cutting, right? And the private hospitals just carry out their surgeries and heap the pressure on the NHS. Something that is not talked about enough, but we're quite happy that Panorama highlighted it recently, is the fact that a lot of people who are sent by the NHS to private hospitals are not happy with the services that they're getting in the private hospitals. Panorama, of course, highlighted the fact that there were people who were sent by the NHS to private hospitals who ended up dying in those private hospitals because they got a surgery, had an emergency. One person, quite sadly, the NHS hospital closest to the private hospital they got a surgery in was literally 1 mile away. But because of the bureaucracy of kind of effecting the transfer from the private hospital to the NHS hospital, this person died before the transfer happened.
Sorry, if it had been just the NHS, that person would still be around today,
Absolutely.
probably.
The
Yeah.
NHS, the NHS has, so when you perform elective surgeries, you have to make sure you have kind of secondary care backup to make sure that if somebody has a critical condition as a result of this, you can cover it. These private hospitals don't have it, and people are dying as a result of that.
No, because they see it as an extra cost that they can't justify.
Exactly. Exactly. And just something that the Times recently highlighted, between 2018 and 2022, so a 4-year period, 791 people who were sent by the NHS to private hospitals for surgeries ended up suing those private hospitals for medical negligence and won, right? Those are just those that won. Imagine those that did not win, that but sued and may have actually been right, but lost for some technical reason, right? It's an incredible thing that our politicians are trying to persuade the public to accept this warped reality instead of putting the money where they know it actually works. The NHS has always worked. It was the best in the world at some point. It didn't suddenly stop being the best in the world. What happened between when it was the best in the world and now is that we underfunded it, we understaffed it, and we outsourced it. And it's really important that this election is our opportunity to fight back and get those services back.
Yeah, I think it's so important where you pointed out that there is this belief that, well, the private sector is better or that there are different doctors in the private sector. But as you pointed out, in most cases, it's the same doctors and they're working, extra hours just to make ends meet. And then if they're under massive amounts of pressure, some of them just leave altogether and they go to countries like Canada or Australia where the pay and conditions are much better. You mentioned there about the election. So, of course, there's the general election probably this year, depending on the prime minister's whim. But when we talk about the next government, which will likely be the Labour Party, is in your opinion the NHS safe with Labour in power?
There isn't enough indication at the moment from what they're doing and saying that the NHS is safe with Labour in power. I would say for sure that the NHS is probably safer with Labour in power than it is with the Conservatives in power. We've had 14 years of the Conservatives, and here is what we have with them at the moment. And previous Labour government, while they've done some bad things, PFIs were expended by previous Labour governments. They have also invested significantly into the NHS, and that's one of the core problems with the NHS investment, right? Something that people don't talk enough about is if we had invested in the NHS at the same rate in the last 14 years as we invested between 1955 and 2010, the NHS would have received about 322 billion pounds more than it actually got, right? So that systemic underfunding by the Conservative government, my suspicion is that Labour is probably going to do better on that front. The real question is whether or not they're going to actually put in the right amount of investment. Something that we want to hear more from them on is on privatization. Wes Streeting is really, really vociferous in his belief that we should use the private sector to cut waiting lists. And as I already explained, that is a solution that's not going to work. The government has already been using that solution since 2020. Their elective recovery plan is about 2 years old now, and it's not moved the dial. All it's done is pass public money into the pockets of private shareholders in private hospitals. So the Labour should make a serious commitment that they're going to, number one, invest in the NHS. We are demanding, and I'm going to come to talking about our pledge for the NHS, 40 billion pounds more into the NHS per year to catch up with the rest of Europe, the NHS across the UK, not just in England. The second is, of course, ending NHS outsourcing, bringing contracts back into the NHS when those contracts expire. And the third is reinstating the health secretary's legal duty to provide health services to everyone in England, which is a duty people might actually think that still exists in England. It does not exist anymore. It's a duty that was repealed in 2012.
Mm.
Right now, the quality of care you get depends far more on whether or not your local NHS body is managing their budget well than it depends on anything else, right? So it's basically a postcode lottery at the moment. And what we are saying is that this duty, which gives the health secretary a responsibility for everybody across the country, and not just giving responsibility to local NHS bodies to be responsible for the people in their area. We think it's a really important duty to reinstate that national responsibility, the National Health Service.
How does the NHS, this is a bit of a side question, but how does the NHS compare, in England with the devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland?
So the NHS in England is the NHS across the UK is in trouble at the moment, right? To be fair, I think the NHS in England is actually better off than the NHS in some ways than the NHS in Wales and Scotland. But I think part of the reason for that is that the funding for NHS in England, or the NHS in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, is dependent on something called the Barnett consequential. So if they spend £1 in the NHS in England, they have to give £1, the equivalent of £1 to Scotland, and the same for England and Wales. For Wales and Northern Ireland. So if they are cutting the budgets in England, it has an effect on the budgets of these other nations, right? And these other nations have NHS bodies that over the years. So for example, in Scotland, prescriptions are still free.
Yes.
Right? So they have an NHS in those nations that still provide far more for the people there than the England NHS provides. So when you cut their budgets, it affects the NHS more than it affects the NHS in England. So in that respect, they're doing badly, slightly worse than England is doing. But the reason for that is the underfunding in the national NHS. That's why we are really keen to make the point that it's £40 billion more into the NHS per year to the NHS across the UK. That means about £32 billion per year more in England, something like 3.7 billion more in Scotland, 2.5 more in Wales, and about 1.3 or 4 in Northern Ireland. Right. So we've kind of worked it down into the minutest level to say, put this amount of money here to catch us up with the rest of Europe. And I've already said this 2 or 3 times now. The Health Foundation is a think tank that Labour actually listens to on healthcare. They did an analysis last year that found that we spend in England, or in the UK, we spend £40 billion less on our NHS than the French spend on their healthcare. We spend £73 billion less than the Germans spend on their healthcare. On average, we spend about £40 billion less than the average European country. Some of that is that we have a much more efficient healthcare system. The other countries have some version of insurance, which inevitably adds to the inefficiency of the system, where you have people having to manage the insurance system. We have a tax-based system where everybody, if you're sick, you just go to the hospital or you go to the GP and so on and so forth. That is far more efficient. We rank among the top in the world in efficiency. But there is a bottom to how much you can save in terms of efficiency. And it's clear we've reached that bottom quite a while ago. So it's really, really important that investment begins to be put in the NHS once again.
What about maintaining, recruiting and maintaining staff? What suggestions would you have for a future government in that regard?
I think that, to be honest, there is not a miracle to it. There's not a magic to it. It's paying the NHS staff better.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? Absolutely. If you're paying them better, it's a bit of a vicious circle with NHS staff at the moment, right? I mentioned earlier there's about 150 NHS vacancies right now. And the more people drop off from the service, the more pressure is put on those that are left within the service. And obviously, if you're not paying them enough to incentivize them to stay, a lot of NHS staff, and we are seeing a lot of them making that decision already, a lot of NHS staff are going to make the decision, I'm going to go work for Amazon, I'm going to go stack shelves, earn about the same, and without any of this pressure that you're putting on me to like have people's lives in my hands. I can go do something else that doesn't give me this amount of headache.
And what I find frustrating about this as well, and is that many commentators in the media describe, well, it's a vocation, or you should be willing to work for less wages or less pay because it's as they say, a vocation. But that's not a solution. If you want to maintain the staff, you need to pay them decent wages, and you need to, as you said, you need also to keep up with other nations, because if you're not, people have to pay bills, people have to feed their families. They can't live off claps or whatever it was during the pandemic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just to add one more thing to that. Obviously, for a lot of NHS staff, it's a vocation, right? They see it as something they love to do. And a lot of them are still, I mean, we still have a lot of people working in the NHS and knowing that they're earning less than they would earn if they were working in other countries, but they keep doing it because it's what they love doing. But we cannot also take them for granted, right? We absolutely cannot take them for granted because we know that people will live, right? And if we want to maintain our NHS, there is no NHS without NHS staff. That is the quickest way for whichever politicians want to destroy the NHS in order to open market opportunities for their friends in the private healthcare sector. The best way for them to destroy the NHS is to get NHS staff to leave. There's literally no NHS without NHS staff. So that's an important part. And that's part of what the 40 billion pounds more a year that we are demanding must go to funding more NHS, of course, paying the NHS staff we have better, but training more NHS nurses and doctors, putting in place programs within the NHS in terms of mental health, in terms of social kind of ways to help people look after their children while they're working in the NHS, things that help NHS staff work well within the NHS. And these are programs that have been in the NHS for a while, but are being cut. And you may have heard 2 weeks ago or so, NHS England wanted to cut the mental health support that NHS staff had. After thousands of NHS staff signed a letter, they had to do a U-turn on that. That's the kind of the mind-numbing policies that we are seeing in the NHS right now. And NHS England has to deal with the cuts from national government, right? And so it's time for us to demand that proper funding be actually put into the NHS.
It's great work that you guys are doing. In what way can members of the public help, be it to support you at We Own It, or in general at their own level in society? Is there any advice you can give to people?
Absolutely. So if you would like to get involved in the work that we do, obviously we don't just work in the NHS, we also work on other public services, the rail, water, energy, and water is a big one at the moment, obviously with so much sewage being poured into our rivers and seas. Do go to weonit.org.uk. You could navigate your way through the website. You could take action. There are a bunch of actions on the website that you could take immediately to start being involved. You could give a donation. You could invite friends and family to be involved in the work. The work that I am personally leading on at the moment, which I'm really keen to talk about, is what we're calling Pledge for the NHS. Obviously, after 14 years, it's time for us to elect leaders who are going to fight for NHS in Parliament. So one way that we are approaching doing that is saying to parliamentary candidates across the country of all parties, commit that if elected, you're going to use your position to work toward 3 policies. Number 1, invest 40 billion pounds more into the NHS across the UK per year. Number 2, end outsourcing. Number 3, reinstate the health secretary's legal duty to provide health services for all. So what we are doing is, and I hope there's going to be a link in the chat later on.
I will, yeah.
We've prepared a tool on our website that essentially allows you to put in your postcode. Your postcode is important because it allows the system to find the candidates in your area. Put in your postcode, and it takes you quickly to a letter that we have already prepared. and you send that letter to your candidates, right? That process from beginning to end takes no more than 2 minutes. We make a point of making sure that every action we ask people to take is as simple and easy as possible. You can literally do it while your kettle is boiling, right? So click on the link in the chat, take that action right now, and let's put pressure on these candidates. Our belief is that two things. Number one is that we can actually have an impact by forcing these candidates to talk about the NHS in this election. A lot of the parties are trying to skate by without talking about the NHS and the investment it needs. This can force them to do that. But secondly, we're already getting a lot of candidates taking the pledge, and a lot of them are likely to win. We have some like 22 SMP candidates having taken the pledge right now. We have, I think, 5 or 6 Plaid Cymru candidates having taken the pledge. And we're working on getting more candidates taking the pledge as well. And a lot of those people are going to end up in Parliament. And what we want to do is go back to them after the election, because the fight doesn't end when the election finishes. We want to go back to them after the election and say, you promised that you're going to fight for this. Now, here is something you can do to help make this happen. And that's how we win this fight. We have to put in the work now during the election so we can use that as leverage after the election.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for speaking to me, Johnbosco, about this, and the best of luck. I leave links in the description of this video so people can check it out. And I think I mentioned on my own channel sometimes before that marching protests are a good way to send a message, but in many ways, sending a letter to an MP or a candidate has much more impact, I think. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we finish for today?
No, I just want to say thank you so much for
My pleasure.
giving us the opportunity to talk about these really important issues on here. Of course, people can go to weonit.org.uk, sign up to join our email list. That is, if you want to be more involved in our work, we send out 1 or 2 emails a week. We don't bombard you with emails. Most weeks we send 1, 2 if there is something that happens in the world that we need to react to. And we give you opportunities to do something small, but that can have a really big impact. Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thanks.
Thank you.